This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Impeached President Yoon may dodge arrest yet again as investigators push for more time to enforce a warrant. Meanwhile, supporters rally near Yoon's home, vowing to block any attempt to detain him. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken condemns North Korea's missile test during a visit to Seoul, calling for regional stability in what's likely to be his final overseas trip before stepping down. And China's foreign minister kicks off the year with a four-nation Africa tour, continuing a 35-year tradition to boost Beijing's influence on the continent. And Japan's prime minister wants clarity on why the White House blocked Nippon Steel from buying U.S. steel, warning that the decision could hit future Japanese investments in the world's largest economy. Also in East Asia tonight, Japan on the verge of breaking a record for tourist arrivals set years ago, helped by a weak yen. But it's not quite enough for the authorities, who are aiming to double the footfall in 5 years' time. Can Japan accomplish the feat? And we turn our attention to Japanese whiskey, one of the most sought-after spirits in the world. Competition is getting tougher in this market, worth billions of dollars. So I spoke with a master blender of major producer Suntory to see what they are doing to stay at the top of the game. South Korean investigators are seeking an extension of a warrant to arrest impeached President Yoon, which expires today. Well, they asked police to take over the execution of the arrest warrant after failing to seize him following a 6-hour standoff on Friday. But police declined to do so for legal reasons, saying that they will work with the anti-corruption agency to carry out the arrest. CNA's Lim Yun-suk has more from Seoul.
Braving the cold winter, South Koreans supporting and opposing President Yoon Suk-yeol camped outside the presidential residence. Supporters say they will do all they can for their president, who they feel has been wrongly judged and impeached by parliament, like the last conservative president, Park Geun-hye, who too was impeached and removed from office in 2017.
지금 이 나라가 어떤 상황입니까? 8년 전에 저들은 죄도 없는 박근혜 대통령을 끌어내리고 또다시 윤 대통령을 끌어내리고 있습니다. 말도 안 되는 죄로 국가 수반이 비상계엄령이 문제가 아니잖아요. 근데 저들은 빨리 끌어내리고 공산주의 사회주의 가려고 하는 게.
But these demonstrators say he must be punished for a short-lived martial law declaration on December 3rd, and that the Constitutional Court, which is reviewing the impeachment motion passed by Parliament on December 14, must reach a decision to uphold that motion as soon as possible.
이렇게 부당한 사회에 너무 순응하지 않고 저기서도 단대 집회를 하고 있거든요. 꼭 저희 나라가 올바른 민주주의로 갈 수 있도록 모두가 힘을 맞췄으면 좋겠습니다.
While investigators are trying to arrest President Yoon on charges of insurrection for declaring a martial law, political parties in parliament are clashing over the impeachment motion passed by lawmakers last month, after the main opposition Democratic Party on Friday decided to exclude insurrection charges as grounds for President Yoon's impeachment at the Constitutional Court. It says the revision was needed to expedite court proceedings. But the ruling People Power Party has criticized the move, saying the impeachment motion needs to be nullified for legal reasons and a new vote taken in Parliament.
국회에서 통과된 탄핵소추문을 보면은 첫 번째 문장에 내란 행위를 했다라는 표현이 나오고 내란이라는 말이 38번이나 나옵니다. 탄핵소추문의 중요 사실에 변경이기 때문에 만약 내란죄를 뺀다 그런다면은 탄핵소추는 성립할 수 없는 것입니다.
Mr. Kwon spoke to media outside the Constitutional Court, which held a meeting on Monday over the impeachment motion. The Constitutional Court made no mention of the changes during its briefing to reporters. But the main opposition party has denounced the ruling party for trying to delay the impeachment process.
결국 내란죄에서 벗어난 것처럼 우겨 내란 공범임을 숨기고 내란 수괴를 비호하려는 의도 아닙니까? 국민은 바보가 아닙니다. 국민의 힘은 더 이상 국민을 시험에 들게 하지 마십시오.
Meanwhile, surveys show President Yoon's approval ratings have improved since he was impeached. One poll showed his approval rating at 40% after falling to as low as 17% following his martial law declaration in early December. The Constitutional Court is scheduled to hold its first oral arguments on January 14th. It's unclear if President Yoon will attend in person. Lim Yan-seok, CNA, Seoul.
Earlier on, we spoke to Dr. Jae Song, Adjunct Associate Professor at the Career Research and Engagement Center of Curtin University, and she weighed in on how the political situation in South Korea could evolve in the coming days.
It's likely that the anti-corruption agency, the investigators, will hand over the power, the authority of the arrest to the police, who has probably a more proper and adequate forces to involve to the second attempt to arrest the impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol. But the interesting thing, I was looking at some public polls in South Korea. The president's party, the ruling party, People's Power Party, PPP, is actually gaining support. Their approval rate, the support rate is actually going up. So it means that President Yoon's his legal team's approach and strategy to involve the public campaign has been working. President Yoon himself has been watching YouTube and actually sending letters to his supporters who are far-right activists. And it seems to be working that he's gathering his people around. And it's also very striking because we've already seen what happened in Washington 4 years ago, 2021. We've seen the Capitol riot. Trump is instigating his supporters to gather around to support him. And he's re-elected, we have seen. So maybe Yoon's attempt or the strategy is an inspiration from Trump's re-election. And he's just following his suit that he can probably get away. He believes that he can get away with the martial law, which was unconstitutional. But still, the South Korean public, they are the majority of the population is in support of Yoon's impeachment. And along with the police and the prosecutors in the investigation, there's also a constitutional court ruling over the impeached motion by the National Assembly. So we'll have to see that that's happening in the coming weeks or two. It's very how can I say, the frustrating and disappointing time for South Korea for the new year, because there has been a political vacuum. At the moment, the country is in charge of the second acting president, who used to be the finance minister. But he also seems to be lacking the political will to give support for the investigators to execute those arrest warrants. He's because he used to be hired and recruited by President Yoon, so he's sort of caught in the middle and doesn't really know what to do. So he's not really playing an active role in this.
Outgoing U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, responding to the developments in South Korea, has called it a beacon of democratic resilience. Well, the top diplomat is in Seoul as part of what's believed to be his final overseas trip. Mr. Blinken earlier met with his South Korean counterpart, Cho Tae-yul, where he affirmed that the U.S. is committed to defending its allies. Blinken added that Washington fully trusts Seoul's resilience of its democracy.
Korea's democracy has been tested in recent weeks, just as American democracy has faced challenges throughout our history. But you are responding by demonstrating your democratic resilience. The United States has full confidence in South Korea's institutions, and we reaffirm our unwavering support for the Korean people as they work tirelessly to uphold those institutions.
Mr. Blinken, meantime, condemned North Korea's missile launch today, calling it yet another violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. South Korea's military says it appears the North fired one intermediate-range ballistic missile. Today's launch was Pyongyang's first firing since November 5th, when it launched at least 7 short-range ballistic missiles off its east coast. Well, Japan also joined in condemning the launch. The country's prime minister said though the missile fell outside Japan's exclusive economic zone, it still posed a major threat to its people.
この打ち上げの頻度というものは非常に高いということだと思います。これを回数を重ねるごとに その技術は上がっているというふうに見るのが当然のことでございまして、私どもとしてこのことについては重大な懸念を持っているということでございます。ですから先ほど申し上げましたように、抑止力の強化に向けて我が国としてより一層努力をしていかねばならないということであって、基本的に我が国の独立と平和、これは我が国が守るということでございます。
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has kicked off a week-long visit to Africa. This makes it the 35th straight year where Beijing's top diplomat has chosen to visit the continent for his first overseas trip of the year. Mr. Wang is set to visit Namibia, Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. China's foreign ministry said that the purpose of the trip was to deepen practical cooperation between China and Africa. And it follows the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit held in Beijing last year. Dubbed the biggest diplomatic event that China has held in recent years, President Xi Jinping then pledged billions in new financing for African countries and greater collaboration in areas like security and trade. And for more, we are joined now by CNA's Tan Yu-guan in Shanghai. Yu-guan, first overseas trip for the year for China's foreign minister, and he has picked these 4 African countries. What do you think he's trying to signal that he's sending?
Well, China is clearly trying to signal that it is committed to this long-standing friendship with the continent. Now, China's interest in Africa is both strategic and as well as economic. On the strategic side, it's really a numbers game. Africa make up about a quarter of the number of UN members in the United Nations. It's about 54 African member nations. Now, on the economic front, the continent is both a source of raw materials and energy, as well as a potentially lucrative market for Chinese products. Africa, while still poorer than the West, compared to the West, which is now fraught with political risks and threats of sanctions, the African markets, they have booming populations. Its markets are also relatively underserved. On the resource side, many of Africa's resources are strategic to China. For example, resources that are needed, raw materials that are needed for the manufacturing of batteries for EVs. Now, those EVs, in turn, are welcomed in Africa for helping the continent transition from fossil fuel. Now, you compare that with the reception that Chinese EVs have been receiving in Europe and America. Otelli?
Also, China's foreign ministry, they've spoken about pushing practical cooperation. So which areas in particular are we talking about?
Now, Wang Yi is basically referring to implementing the outcomes of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, a summit that was held in Beijing recently. Now, according to that plan, China and Africa will, in the next 3 years, implement 10 partnership initiatives, and they cover a wide range of areas. They include industrial chain cooperation, healthcare, rural revitalization, common security, green development, and so on. Now, of course, China is also a source of practical and affordable technology for Africa. Just to give you an anecdotal example, one African teacher once lamented that in the past, he would have to describe to his children what technology looks like, but now they can see it on the screens for themselves thanks to Chinese-made low-energy base stations that were installed by Chinese providers. Now, these low-energy base stations solve the problem of unstable power supply. Now, that's just one anecdotal example. China is, of course, a very important trading partner for Africa. It has been Africa's biggest trading partner for over 15 years. And that share of that trade has actually been growing. Now, what's more, China has also given at least the least developed countries, out of which 33 of them comes from Africa, a zero tariff treatment for 100% tariff lines. China is also a source of loans, and these loans have been pivotal for infrastructure and developmental projects. While there have been concerns of debt threat diplomacy, most of those concerns have been largely disproved. Otelli?
Well, thanks so very much for your insights. CNA's Tan Yu-guan in Shanghai. Coming up next on East Asia tonight, Japan demanding answers from Washington after it blocked Nippon Steel's buyout of U.S. Steel on grounds of national security. Plus, activity in China's services sector expanded at the fastest pace since May, signaling an improvement in its domestic economy. Hello again. You're watching East Asia Tonight right here in CNA, and it is now time for your business news with Roland Lim. And Roland, the Japanese Prime Minister, giving his sharpest remarks yet on the failed acquisition of U.S. Steel. What's that all about?
You heard right. Shigeru Ishiba has called for clarity on why U.S. President Joe Biden has blocked Nippon Steel's $15 billion acquisition of U.S. Steel, warning that this could affect future Japanese investments in the U.S.
なぜ安全保障の懸念があるのかということについては、それはきちんと述べてもらわなければ、これから先の話には相なりません。いかに同盟国であろうとも、これから先の関係において、ただいま申し上げた点は非常に重要だと考えておるところでございます。
Shares of Nippon Steel closed in the red, 0.75% lower, losing ground in Tokyo since this morning. Earlier, it fell as much as 2% before paring off some of those losses. President Biden had promised to rebuild the U.S. manufacturing sector and has criticized the deal for months. He cites concerns over the country's second biggest steelmaker in the hands of foreign control. The deal is plagued by worries that the buyout would lead to a cut in U.S. Steel's production, causing supply shortages for domestic transport and energy sectors. But the U.S. steelmaker says the takeover is a lifeline to protect the ailing firm from intense competition abroad. Nippon Steel had hoped the acquisition would help hike its global steel output by nearly a third. It has repeatedly defended the acquisition and has reportedly proposed that Washington is allowed to interfere in any potential production cuts. It also vowed significant investments in U.S. Steel's facilities and employees. Nippon Steel will hold a news conference tomorrow on its proposed acquisition. After a year-end rally in 2024, the Japanese markets opened the first trading day of 25 with a whimper, not a bang. The Nikkei 225 average slipped more than 1.5% or nearly 1.5%, I should say, on profit-taking. This after the index gained 4.4% last month, its biggest monthly rise since February. The broader Topics index, well, that fell by 1%, led by leading exporter Toyota Motors' 4.3% decline. Now, that's as investors await a flurry of U.S. economic data this week to get more clarity on the Fed's rate outlook. Traders are also wary of the prospect of Trump's tariffs leading to inflationary pressures.
市場を取り巻く環境を見渡すと、様々なリスク要因が存在しておりますが、特にトランプ政権の今後の政策動向には注目しているところです。その他、ウクライナ、中東、東アジア情勢をはじめとする地政学リスク、中国経済の不透明感、各国の金融政策の動向とその影響、日本企業の業績動向などには注視が必要です。
As for the rest of East Asia, the Kospi in Seoul outperforming the rest of the region, even as authorities look to extend an arrest warrant for suspended President Yoon Fukuyo. The country's benchmark Kospi index did rise 1.9% to bring gains for the first 3 days of this year to 3.6%, making it the best performing index in Asia so far. Taiwan weighted index is up 2.8% in Taipei. Asian currencies tumbling to a new 2-decade low after a resilient dollar. The yen hitting a 5-month low in December, losing about 5% for the month. Now, it was one of the worst performing among G10 currencies last year amid uncertainties over the Bank of Japan's rate hiking plans. But the weakness of the yen was also a major contributor to the stock market's strength in 2024, boosting earnings for exporters. Meantime, the Korean won is slightly stronger against the greenback, 1,464 points to the dollar. It fell to over a 15-year low back in December. China's services sector expanded at its fastest pace in 7 months as a series of stimulus measures last year helped boost business activity. The Caixin Services Purchasing Managers Index ticked up to 52.2 in December, and that's the fastest expansion in the services activity since May in the private sector gauge. The companies reported more business inflows and a rise in average selling prices for the first time since June. That comes despite renewed contraction in exports. The reading matches the official survey last week showing improvements in the services sector after authorities deployed a raft of stimulus measures back in September. China's stimulus plans are also seen to be the main driver for equities there this year, especially in the wake of recent lackluster economic data and the threat of U.S. tariffs under the next Trump administration. Investors looking ahead to March for potential announcements when the National People's Congress meets to set growth targets. Now, they are hoping for a stimulus-led rally after Chinese stocks posted their worst start to the year in nearly a decade last week. Quick check on the Greater China markets. Well, both the Shanghai Composite and the Shenzhen Component down by just a touch, and the Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong down 0.4%. Despite the expansion in the services sector, Standard Chartered strategist Steve Bryce said that Beijing may hold back on rolling out more stimulus measures.
I think we're still in the sort of muddle through stage when it comes to policy. Obviously, the authorities are worried about debt and deflation. So obviously deflation, we get inflation data out later this week. That's expected to show continued decline in producer prices and very stagnant consumer prices. So they clearly don't want that to go decidedly negative. So they want to keep inflation positive at least. But they are worried about the debt side of the equation as well. Debt to GDP ratio, despite what's going on in the economy, is still continuing to rise. So they're really trying to balance this out and try and figure out what's the best approach. Obviously, markets from time to time go and look for the big bang approach, on the fiscal side. But I think, we're going to see, them really just trying to balance those two factors. So from that perspective, markets likely to muddle through as well. Probably deliver positive returns. Earnings growth should be relatively strong, but no bazooka.
Top energy equipment maker GE Vernova is bullish on prospects for its gas business in Asia, given that its two biggest economies, that's China and Japan, and the growing global south. Today, GE Vernova's gas and wind turbines help to generate about a third of the world's electricity. Now, earlier I caught up with its CEO, Scott Strazik, and he tells me that the weakness in its wind turbine business segments has been offset by strong demand for its gas turbines and electrical grid equipment to serve the soaring power needs for data centers.
We see real opportunities wherever you have economies that are continuing to grow. You think about places like Taiwan, there's real need for more electrons. When you think about chip foundries and factories that require real demand in different ways, and we see opportunity to serve that market. You can't really be talking about Asia and not think about the largest economies in Asia, whether it be China or Japan for that matter, that create real demand opportunities. So it's less about which markets are we focused on and not, and more that there's different markets that require different solutions because they have different resources.
With, I guess, the demand of new energy, would you be able to meet the pipeline? I mean, are you in an overcapacity state right now or under capacity?
Well, it depends on where in the portfolio, but I do think there will be supply chain constraints for us to be able to meet the demand as quickly as the market wants it today. And the geopolitics of supply chains are difficult. So that's going to be a real opportunity for the companies that can figure that out and navigate that effectively. But it's not going to be easy to fulfill on the demand that's ahead of us, but I like our chances.
And that's the latest in business. It's back to you, Tally.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, time now for another break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Japan aiming to welcome 60 million visitors by the year 2030. Now, that's almost double the current number, but already there are concerns about over-tourism, with crowds, traffic congestion, and rubbish among common complaints. And to help break down the complexities of this issue, we'll be speaking with Gary Bauman, Director of Czech in Asia, in just a moment. You're watching East Asia tonight. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi begins the year with a four-nation African tour, making it the 35th straight year where Beijing's top diplomat has chosen to visit the continent for his first overseas trip of the year. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken condemns North Korea's missile test during a visit to Seoul and calls for regional stability in what's likely to be his final overseas trip before stepping down. And impeached President Yoon Song-yeol may dodge arrest yet again as investigators push for more time to enforce a warrant. Meanwhile, supporters rally near Yoon's home, vowing to block any attempt to detain him. South Korean authorities are extending the closure of Muan International Airport following that crash of a Jeju Air passenger jet last week. Well, the shutdown will now be expected until 14th of January. Government ministries had originally planned to reopen the airport tomorrow, but local media are reporting that the government is considering keeping the runway closed until the reinstallation of the localizer, the instrument landing system that was on a mound, identified as a major cause that exacerbated the extent of the disaster. Well, the report said that in addition to the localizer, there are numerous unresolved issues related to the crash investigation and assessment of other facilities. Well, the aircraft had landed without wheels, skidding off the runway and hit the outer wall. The impact broke the fuselage in half, which also caught fire. Only 2 crew members survived out of the 181 people on board that plane. Well, intense scrutiny on Jeju as well. Local media, Yonhap News Agency, says that the budget airline suffered the most flight delays due to maintenance reasons in the first half of 2024 compared to other domestic airlines. Government data shows more than 500 Jeju Air flights were delayed. Now, that's out of a total of nearly 53,000 flights. The figure is the highest among domestic carriers, which includes industry leader and full-service airline Korean Air. Korean Air had more total flights, but fewer maintenance-related delays at 422. Now, the recent Jeju Air incident has raised concerns. The low-cost carrier might have prioritized operations over maintenance and safety. The plane involved was found to have flown 13 flights in the 48 hours before it crashed. The airline has said it will cut 10 to 15% of flight operations by March to enhance safety. Now, Japan's tourist arrivals are set to top 35 million in 2024, surpassing the all-time high of nearly 32 million back in 2019. Well, analysts say that the demand for travel to Japan is growing on the back of stronger air connectivity and a positive exchange rate for international travelers, given the weak yen. Well, official data shows Japan, apparently it saw more than 33 million visitors from January to November last year. That's more than the 4 previous years combined. Well, Chinese and South Koreans make up the majority. Visitor spending, meanwhile, is estimated to reach $40 billion in 2024, nearly 25% more than 2019. Accommodation, shopping, and food top the visitor spending list. But if Japan's numbers for 2024 are impressive, they're nowhere near where the country actually wants to be. Japan wants to see 60 million visitors a year by 2030, almost double the current numbers. And to reach that target, Tokyo has just launched a 10-year multiple entry visa for rich Chinese. It's also doubled the maximum length of stay for Chinese tourists who travel in groups. And Chinese travelers 65 years and older no longer have to prove they are employed. And that's to boost tourism in regions that are seeing fewer tourists than before the pandemic, despite the overall increase in visitors to Japan. Top destinations, Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto continue to attract the bulk of tourists. But the visitor boom in these areas have become problematic for residents. Crowds, traffic congestion, and rubbish are among the complaints.
Yes, I understand they're coming and they're bringing money into the country, but there are either different social norms or lack of manners. And when I first came here, this was like a nice little surfing community. It was very peaceful. And as it's got more and more touristy, we've started putting up all these things here and people coming in, and it's annoying because a lot of people, before they get on the train, they'll come in here and have a coffee and a cigarette, just throw it on the ground.
In response, authorities have started enforcing restrictions like a cap on visitors or advanced bookings to manage hotspots. And they're also hiring security officers to control crowds and minimize inconvenience to locals. Right, for more, we are joined now by Gary Bauman, Asia Travel and Tourism Analyst and Director of Check-in Asia. Well, thanks for joining us this evening, Gary. So, Japan's aiming for 60 million visitors by 2030. I mean, do you think that the country is really ready for such a big influx? Because I saw that there was a survey where it said that over 30% of the tourists say that they faced over-tourism issues last year. So, is that something that Japan can manage?
Yeah, good evening, Oteli. It's a great question. I mean, if you look at the figures that you're talking about, 60 million by 2030. If you go back to 2010, Japan had just 8.6 million visitors. So the growth over 20 years has been astonishing. It continues to be astonishing. It continues to attract travelers, particularly from Asia Pacific. If you look so far this year, 70% of visitors are from just 5 markets in Asia Pacific. So it has that appeal, it has that tourism appeal, but jumping up to 60 million takes travel and tourism into a new era, into a new realm in Japan. We've had that post-pandemic boom, we've had that resurgence, we've had that revenge travel boom, but as travel and tourism normalizes, as competition across the region intensifies to attract tourism, it's a big figure. It's a big political figure, I would say.
You mentioned the growth is astonishing, but in terms of trying all of that, obviously, adding pressure on its infrastructure. And I'm wondering, is technology helping enough to sort of ease that strain?
Well, that's a big question. So you mentioned that there will be pressure. Of course, there is already on infrastructure, on services, on healthcare, potentially in future if you've got more visitors coming to the country. But the labor shortage is a massive problem for Japan. We know that technology is going to have to play a huge part. Japan has one of the fastest rates of population aging in the world. The labor force is declining. And tourism is struggling from that. You speak to anybody in any part of the industry in Japan, and they're struggling to get staff, struggling to train staff, and struggling to attract staff as well. So going forward, that will be a huge challenge for the industry across the country.
So, Gary, we know that all these tourists, I mean, the bulk of them, they're flocking to Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, these places. Do we know, are there strategies in place to promote the less visited areas to sort of help spread the visitors more evenly across the country?
Yeah, that's very important. And for most destinations, I mean, Thailand is a good example in Southeast Asia, Japan definitely in Northeast Asia, of how do you actually increase the numbers, but you disperse people more fairly across the country, not just so that you reduce the negative effects of over-tourism, but you actually spread the benefits as well. Yeah, Japan has been trying to do this. It has a very well-structured and very well-managed approach to tourism. But, tourism has changed a great deal, particularly in the social media era, is people go where they want to go. And in particularly first-time tourists want to go to the key, to the hotspots, the golden triangle of Japan. I think you referenced earlier that it's trying with this new 10-year visa for Chinese travelers, for affluent Chinese travelers. I think it hopes that over time, those travelers will go to different places during each visit. So they won't be going back to the same places. But it's difficult. You're trying to turn around a culture that, people want to go to Japan for specific reasons. They know what they want to see. And that's often the key, the primary hotspots.
And touching on this particular survey as well, apparently over 60% of the foreign tourists said they'd be okay with paying higher fees if it helps reduce crowding and protect these cultural sites. Do you think that is something that Japan, is already looking into, trying to introduce some measures?
It is trying to do that. And you've seen that locally in different prefectures across the country, seeing different rates in terms of hotel taxes, visitor fees. There's a famous castle, Himeji Castle, which wants to increase the entry fee for foreign visitors. But these things, it's unproven whether these actually have much impact. And particularly when you have such high numbers of tourists that come in for relatively short periods of time. A lot of the travelers into Japan are from within the region. They don't stay for very long, so they want to hit hotspots and they want to go where they want to go. And that makes it more difficult to increase the length and the duration of the stay and to spread the spending around the country.
And well, tourism is booming. I mean, that's great. But I feel for some of the locals there, though. I mean, especially the retirees, where they're finding it harder to afford their own domestic vacations, in their own country. Do you think that could possibly become a real issue with locals feeling priced out of exploring their own country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's already happened. I mean, you referenced in the intro the low-priced yen, the low-value yen, which is attracting more tourists to Japan, and that's absolutely true. But it has also stoked inflation, and particularly inflation in hotel rates, for example. And there's been a lot of complaints from domestic Japanese tourists that they're being priced out of some of the destinations that they want to go because the hotel rates are too expensive. I think the next phase, Oteli, increasing tourism after the pandemic in the way Japan has done has been very successful. But it has created a lot of issues already. The next phase will be even more difficult. It will bring certainly more challenges in terms of public sentiment, in terms of pressure on infrastructure, on healthcare, on services, and of course costs, and that's a big issue.
And do you think that's also in part caused by, the Chinese dollar, the strength of that, right? About how important Chinese tourists are to Japan's economy. And we talked about this 10-year multiple entry visa. We talked about the relaxed rules for group tours. To what extent do you think that is really going to boost tourism, but at the same time, it's going to cause, sort of like issues that we talked about with over-tourism?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, China is the growth market. It's the biggest market in the region, and it's the hottest market for Japan. It was over the last 5 years before the pandemic, and it's certainly revving back up again post-pandemic. But again, it comes back a little bit to geography. Japan and China are not very far apart, and people can travel from China to Japan for short trips, for long weekends, for part of the Golden Weeks. You don't have to stay particularly long. And when they don't stay for very long, they tend to stay in the same places. And therefore, you're going to have these same problems recurring. The longer term visa, I think, is a smart tactic by the Japanese government to try and disperse tourism, to try and encourage people to try and buy loyalty, because there isn't much loyalty in tourism anymore. People don't really are not loyal to destinations or to brands. They're loyal to their pocket and where their own experiences are going to take them. So, if they can actually attract more Chinese tourists to come back more regularly, then hopefully they will travel to different destinations. But otherwise, the main destinations like Japan, Osaka, Kyoto, they are still interesting to travelers, whether it's second, third, or fourth visit, because there's so much of interest culturally, in terms of cuisine, in terms of the things that you can see and do in those cities. They're very, very big cities. And you can't catch it all in 3 or 4 days. So people do come back, and that's repeat visits. Is how do you manage repeat visits going forward?
And before I let you go, Gary, I just thought I'd hear your perspective, on this particular question about Chinese tourism. And clearly, it's a major economic driver. But do you think that can somewhat help bridge the historical tensions between Japan and China?
Yeah, that's the eternal question, I'll tell you. It's a difficult one, because I think that the issues in terms of politics and in terms of trade and diplomacy are very, very different to general people's attitudes to where they want to go and where they want to travel, particularly young Chinese travelers who view travel and tourism as integral to their lifestyle. And Japan is very, very appealing to them. It has a lot of things that appeal to them, and as we said, in terms of culture, in terms of the anime culture, the technology is different, the landscapes are different. And the service levels are very, very high. There's a lot that appeals to Chinese travelers in Japan. And that's very different to the political and the trade and economic issues.
I really appreciate your insights. Always good chatting with you. I'm going to leave you to enjoy your dinner now. Gary Bauman, Asia Travel and Tourism Analyst and Director of Check-in Asia. All right, coming up on East Asia tonight, Japanese whiskey has taken the world by storm since a decade ago. But what lies ahead for this fine artistry amid production constraints and growing competition? And later, monumental ice sculptures in China's Harbin city, inspiring travelers from across the nation in sub-zero temperatures. Japanese whiskey took the world by storm about a decade ago. But now, with fierce competition from global rivals, demand has somewhat cooled compared to 2 years ago. Still, its rise in a crowded whiskey world has been nothing short of remarkable, especially since producer Suntory's Hibiki and Yamazaki brands began racking up international awards and gaining global recognition in 2013, with prices the following years surging dramatically as bottles flew off the shelves. Now, here is a quick look at the numbers. In 2022, the Japanese whiskey market was worth an estimated $3.86 billion, according to research firm Spherical Insights. Now, fast forward to 2032, and it is projected to more than double to a jaw-dropping $9.32 billion. That's a 9.2% annual growth rate. Interestingly, single malt whiskey didn't even arrive in Japan until 1923, when the Yamazaki distillery fired up its first stills that is used to produce the liquid. And this was all thanks to Masataka Taketsuru, who returned from Scotland armed with a secret sauce of whiskey making. Now, his story even inspired a hit TV drama, Masan, based on the lives of Taketsuru and his Scottish wife. And it didn't just get the word buzzing about Japanese whiskey. It also sparked a renewed sense of pride back home in Japan, driving domestic sales. Well, since then, Tokyo has taken Edinburgh's playbook and added its own flair. It's not just the climate or ingredients. The real magic is the artistry of blending. Choosing and combining barrels to craft the perfect product is where Japanese whiskey shines. And to dive deeper, I earlier spoke with and sipped with an industry legend, the mastermind behind some of the world's finest drams. So here's my disclaimer. I'm not exactly a whiskey connoisseur, more of a wine enthusiast to be honest, but I've always been intrigued by the meteoric rise of Japanese whiskey. And I'm in for a real treat today because I get to meet the chief blender of the House of Suntory, Shinji Fukuyo. He's going to be walking us through the craftsmanship of this exceptional spirit. So will I be converted from a wine lover to a whiskey aficionado? Let's find out. Well, still very nice to meet you, Shinji-san. So tell us a little bit more about your job, your role as a chief blender, and also your philosophy behind blending.
I'm the fifth generation chief blender of Suntory. So as a blender, when we blend whiskeys, we have to pay attention in details to make a good balanced whiskey.
And also you need to have a keen sense of smell and taste. So how do you keep them in good condition?
Using my northern tongue, that's why I don't eat any garlic food weekdays. So from Sunday dinner to Friday lunch, I don't eat any garlic.
What about fish though? Fish is a big part of the Japanese diet.
Oh yes, but the fish oil, it tended to remain in my mouth. That's why I don't eat any fish for breakfast.
So what is the difference between Eastern and Western palates when it comes to whiskey?
Japanese palate is very delicate, so, and also always enjoy that there is a good balance. Not very strong taste, not very bitter.
So can you tell us a little bit more about woods and barrels? Because if I'm not mistaken, different woods will produce different flavors as well as colors, right?
Yes, and now we are using three different types of wood. So mainly we use American white oak, which gives a spirit very vanilla and light flavor. Another one is Spanish oak, which gives a very dark in color and dried fruits and some bitterness as well. So, and also, it's very unique. We are using a Japanese oak, Mizunara, which gives a very spicy note. It's like a incense or temple flavor.
Think the popularity of Japanese whiskey, and obviously that's tied to also what people are willing to pay for a bottle of whiskey. Why do you think it has skyrocketed in the last decade?
Our hypothesis would be Japanese nature and Japanese craftsmanship are a bit different from others. So nature-wise, like water is very pure and very clean, and also that climate, we have a very hot, humid summer and very dry and cold winter. So some kind of dynamic changing through the year, it accelerates whiskey maturation. And also craftsmanship. Probably Japanese work always very detailed and very precise.
It's very exciting that Suntory has launched the Hibiki 40-year-old, and there are only 400 bottles worldwide. And this masterpiece here is your vision. So can you walk us through, the aging process to, get down to this exceptional spirit?
Actually, our whiskey production started 100 years ago. We celebrated 100 years production last year. So this year marks the next 100 years. That's why we decided to challenge something different.
So this is a moment of truth. I have not had a sip of whiskey in like 20 years. Yeah, so I'm going to be tasting this, and it's a 40-year-old Hibiki, no less. So I'm going to try my best to describe what it smells like. Kind of like sandalwood, incense. I'll taste it now. Very peppery, fiery, tropical fruits. Am I on the right track?
Thank you for your wonderful answer.
And very smooth, very, very smooth.
It's perfect comment. Nothing to correct, right?
Oh, that is amazing. Well, I've learned so much from you, Shinji-san. Thank you so very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Toast.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yes. Well, American television series Shogun proving once again that it's the show to beat come awards season, as it bagged the prestigious Best Drama Television Series trophy at yesterday's Golden Globe Awards ceremony. Well, the historical epic set in Imperial Japan took home 4 awards in total, including Best Actress and Best Actor in a television drama, as well as the Best Supporting Male Actor. Main actor and show producer Hiroyuki Sanada says that it was a gamble to produce a drama consisting of 70% Japanese dialogue and subtitles, but it managed to break the wall of language. The accolades come after the Samurai series picked up a record total of 18 Emmy Awards a few months ago. Residents in Japan also reveled in the win.
苦労が多かったと思うので、その苦労が報われて、そして日本人として納得のいく時代劇を撮ることができたっていうのもすごく素晴らしいなと思います。
すごいことだと思います。アメリカで評価されているっていうのはすごいことだと思います。
Harbin's Ice and Snow Festival has opened in northern China, treating tourists to a visual feast of ice castles and sculptures with ice slides for the active. Fireworks lit up the frozen wonderland at the annual festival in Heilongjiang province. Many tourists from the warmer southern Chinese provinces come to enjoy the cooler temperatures, a chilly -20 degrees Celsius. Well, they're among the millions of visitors who throng the annual event. Staff say that this year's event is the largest in history, with a record 300,000 cubic meters of ice and snow used. One star attraction is a super ice slide, which this year stretches more than half a kilometer long.
滑梯就是很刺激，冲下来的时候，然后它有一些抖动的坡度，然后会这样跳起来，跳起来的时候特别刺激。
没有啊，还是很新奇的，看到一些，我感觉是艺术家啊，他们做这些都是很辛苦的，我自己都冷了受不了，他们还是很厉害的。
And ahead on Asia tonight, here are some of the stories that we're also covering. Malaysia's Court of Appeal has granted a bid by Najib Razak to see documents that the former Prime Minister says would allow him to serve the rest of his 6-year jail term for corruption under house arrest. He was convicted in 2022 on graft charges involving around $10 million from former 1MDB subsidiary SRC International. Indonesia officially launches its first nationwide free meal program aimed at providing nutritious meals to school-aged children. It's a move expected to benefit more than 80 million people in its first 2 years of operations. And American lawmakers are meeting today to certify Donald Trump's win in the 2024 election, exactly 4 years since his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol in Washington, seeking to overturn his 2020 election loss. And we'll be speaking to our correspondent for all the details. These stories and more on Asia Tonight, 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, right here on CNA. And that wraps up Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia and find us on Facebook and YouTube as well. Have a good evening.